Did you ever wonder how the term police sting got its name? Well, you're about to find out. Hello, I'm Bob R. Scott. In 1977, I retired from the Metropolitan Police Department as a lieutenant with 22 years of service. In the middle of the 1970s, I was director of the very first police sting operation. This is an undercover operation where we arrested 565 criminals, recovered $5.5 million of stolen property, recovered over $100,000 worth of drugs, closed 1,800 criminal cases, and had a 99% conviction rate. In this documentary, I'm going to show you how it began, the planning, and the end results. As you watch this documentary, keep in mind that some of the videos and photographs are over 45 years old, that they are surprisingly clear. To make it easier to follow and not just watching a talking head, I've done some clip art and some Photoshop. I'm doing this documentary because I want all the brave men and women who work with me on these projects to get the recognition and credit for its success. And it's 2020, we're in a coronavirus pandemic, I'm 85 years old and in lockdown. I gathered up some old photographs and videos, put them together to make this documentary. The second day after I was sworn in, they put me undercover, which lasted a little over a year. I was then transferred to the Vice Squad and remained there for 3 years. Promoted to detective, transferred to the 14th Precinct Detectives. A few years later, I made detective sergeant and worked with various detective squads, including the 14th Precinct. In 1969, I was promoted to lieutenant. I worked in uniform for a short time and then went back in plain clothes as supervisor of the 5th District Detective. Most career police officers, once they get acclimated, they choose a specific field. Some enjoy being uniform officers, others find administrative positions, and some become detectives, which was my choice. As a detective, my focus was on arresting fences. Why fences? Because they're the ones that bought the stolen property. And many times the stolen property came from a more serious crime, such as items taken in a burglary, in a robbery, from a rape victim, and sometimes even murder. When I caught a fence, I turn him and have him give up the names of the ones he bought the property from. This way I was able to arrest several criminals instead of just one. In the early 70s, I was transferred to the 2nd District Office Theft Squad with several detectives, and to my delight, Sergeant Mattis, who I had worked with in the 14th Precinct. At our first meeting, we all introduced ourselves, and they were about to bring me up to date on their cases when I heard a loud metal clang. I said, "What was that?" Sergeant Mattis smiled and said, "That's Bob Schaefer and Pat Lilly hitting the fire alarm bell. They're always clowning around like that, but they're good detectives." Then Detective Lilly and Schaefer come in and said they were sorry for being late. Before the meeting ended, I said, "We'll be working under P.T. Mott." They looked puzzled. Detective Schaefer said, "Who's P.T. Mott?" I told him, it's not who's P.T. Mott, it's what's P.T. Mott. It's an old rule I've been using throughout my career. The acronym stands for Put the Meat on the Table. Yeah, they all laughed, but they caught on quick. At that time, the 2nd District policed the major business center of the city. We were having a tremendous problem with expensive office equipment being stolen, especially the new high-dollar IBM Selectric typewriters. I pushed them to find out who was buying them. In other words, find me the fence. They were able to recover a lot of stolen property, but no fence. Then one day, Detective Schaefer came to me and said, "Lieutenant, instead of us trying to catch a fence, why don't we become the fence?" I thought that was a great idea and had a lot of potential. Unfortunately, there was no money available to buy stolen items, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I thought our property is costing insurance companies a lot of money. Why don't I go to them and see if I can get some funds to help us? Obviously, I couldn't do it without getting permission from the Chief of Police. I asked Lieutenant Mosby, who I worked with in the 14th Precinct and was now commander of the 2nd District Detectives. It also didn't hurt that he happened to be my best friend. I asked him to go with me to see the chief. He agreed, so we went to see Chief Cullinane. After advising the chief that we wanted to set up a fencing operation, and since there were no funds available, we wanted to go to the insurance companies and try to raise funds from them. He said, "Okay, but with one caveat. Lieutenant Mosby has to go with you." When we got outside, I asked Mo, "Why do you think the chief said that you had to go with me?" Mo laughed and said, "He knows that when it comes to department policies and procedures, you go through them like a lawnmower going through red tape, and I have to go behind you and put in all the pieces together." We both laughed because we knew it was true. We went to several of the top insurance company executives and told them what we wanted and how it would benefit them. We were able to raise a little over $10,000 in checks made out to the Metropolitan Police Department. I now had some money to work with. We got a friend of the police to let us use one of his unoccupied stores at 1625 K Street Northwest. We put a hidden video camera and microphone inside a file cabinet and cut a hole out for the camera lens. I assigned Vince Tolson, an experienced detective, to act as the fence, using the alias of Al White. We had two detectives across the street in an unmarked police car with department radios using line of sight to the store as backup. We used an informant to bring potential customers in. Al White was able to make several buys. About 2 weeks into the operation, I got a call from FBI agent Bob Lill, who wanted to meet with me. Back then, the FBI and the police department didn't exactly get along that well. I was curious and leery, but I said okay. When we met, he told me he had heard about our undercover operation from Lieutenant Kerwin in our intelligence division. Bob said that he wanted to join us. I was about to turn him down until he told me that there was a government grant program available through LEAA, that if the FBI and the police department worked together on a project, they could get a grant up to $450,000, which in my mind meant no more begging. I then told him that the FBI has a reputation of taking and not giving, and if we go into this operation, he's going to have to give. I asked him, "Does that work for you?" He said, "Absolutely." I told him that the first time they didn't, we're done. He agreed. Jumping ahead a little, I want you to know that he kept his word. The fact is that he turned out to be one of the best partners I ever worked with. So it began. He assigned FBI agent Chuck Harrison, alias Eddie, to work with Al White at the 8th Street store. Chuck was the backup man and monitored the video camera from the office above. A few weeks later, I got a call from Lieutenant Kerwin. He told me that the New York Police Department had tried a similar operation and the officer got shot. He suggested I call Captain Heron, who was the commander of the operation, to see what happened. When I called the captain, I asked him to tell me what happened. He said, "Sure, but it would be much better if you came to see me." I thought, why can't he just tell me? So we set up a date. Me, Bob Lill, Sergeant Mattis, and Agent Mike Hartman drove up to New York and met with the captain. When we met, the first thing he said was, "Before we start, why don't you tell me how you're set up?" When I finished, he said, shut it down today. You guys are playing with fire." Lil and I looked at each other, discreetly shaking our heads, no way. About that time, Sergeant Walter Melnick, who was in charge of the operation in the field, came in. They showed us some photographs of the operation aftermath. It showed a turned over desk, blood all over the floor, and bullet holes everywhere. Then they told us that they had set up a fencing operation in a street level store. The undercover officer would sit at a desk and had a backup man in the next room taking movies through a two-way mirror and armed with a shotgun. In the desk drawer was a hidden microphone for the camera. They also had two backup detectives in the store across the street. Their plan was that if someone came in and tried to hold them up, they would give up the money and arrest them later rather than jeopardize the operation. After all, they had the movie film as evidence. Sergeant Melnick had set up a movie screen and projector. It showed the undercover detective sitting at a desk talking on a telephone, and two subjects in the store kind of walking around. When the officer hangs up the phone, one of the suspects shows him a ring that they wanted to sell. Then some of the subject pulls out a gun. The movie went blank. It went blank because the backup officer dropped the camera and picked up his shotgun. The captain told us, although the movie stopped, the microphone on the desk was still going. He then turned on the tape recorder and played it. Because the talking and the yelling is difficult to understand, I'm going to use clip art with closed captions. Two guys come in while the storefront officer is talking on the telephone, sitting at a desk. The two subjects wander around the office.
All right. Okay, if you can't come, man, give me a call, huh?
When the officer hangs up the phone, one of the subjects shows him a ring that he wanted to sell. The officer looks at the ring.
Nothing, I'm saying no. We crush up the setting. That way, though.
The cameraman drops the camera and picks up the shotgun.
Lay on the floor. Lay on the floor. Lay on the floor. Lay on the floor. Put your hands up. Put your hands up. Just lay on the floor. Ready, go. Wait a minute. Yeah, right. That's it, baby. Right. Come to the tree. Quiet. Where's the rest of the money? Where's the rest of the money, right? That's it. I'm gonna bust it. You don't kick out with the rest of the cash. Where's the rest of the money, Ron? Baby, you got it. You got my goddamn. Oh my God. Goddamn. Single that here.
The backup man knows that he's going to shoot the officer, so he doesn't hesitate any longer. The backup officers across the street hear the commotion and come running over. The bad guy behind the desk just won't give up. They then go to the aid of their wounded officer and call for an ambulance.
We need an ambulance at 18718 Hillside Avenue.
Fortunately, the officer survived. Sergeant Melnick said there were 32 shots fired. 32! So much for letting the robbery go down and arrest them later. I got a sickening feeling in my stomach. I could just see the same thing happen to Detective Tulson. I looked over and I could see that Bob Lill and the others were having the same reaction. I said to Bob Lill, "I'm shutting this down." Bob, without hesitation, said, "Yes." I asked the captain if I could use his phone. I called Detective Tulson at the store and told him to close the operation down right now. He asked why. I told him that I'd explain when I got back. Just shut it down right now. Before we left, Captain Herron gave us copies of the shooting on a cassette tape. On the 3-hour trip back to Washington, we were passing ideas back and forth, how to set up, how to eliminate that from happening to us, etc. When we got back, I played the tape for the office theft squad and later for Inspector Miller and Chief Cullinane. Everyone shook their heads in disbelief. A couple of days later, Bob and I had put a basic plan together and shared it with the office theft crew. SAC Nick Stames and Chief Cullinane approved. Since recovering stolen office equipment is why we started this in the first place, we decided we would front the operation as an office machine repair shop. We believed that to become more popular with the criminal element, we would put the word out that we were members of organized crime from New York trying to take over the fencing business in Washington. Now I know that Washington didn't have organized crime like they do in New York, but what a great cover this would be. Plus, we were pretty sure the only mafia they knew about was what they saw in the movies and on TV. So we decided to give it a shot. We looked at several locations throughout the city, but none seemed suitable until we found a warehouse in a rundown commercial area on 25th Place Northeast. It was on a dead-end street, which meant that there would be very little traffic in and out. It had a garage with a roll-up door, which would allow the undercover officers and the agents to park their cars inside. It also had a double gate on the side leading to the warehouse's loading docks. Across the street was the city's bus storage depot. It had a high chain link fence surrounding it, which would reduce people on that side of the street to see what we were doing. I called the landlord and told him that we were with PFF out of New York and were interested in leasing the property. We set up a meeting. Incidentally, PFF stands for Police, FBI, Fence, Incognito. I borrowed a Cadillac with New York tags from ATF for the meeting. When we met the property manager, we didn't tell him that we were law enforcement. In fact, just the opposite. We acted like some wise guys with New York accents, which was easy for me since I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He took us on a tour of the building. We could see the potential right away. I told him we'd like to lease it for 6 months. He then said he didn't think it would work out and refused to rent it. That wasn't going to work. I went to see a K-Fritz executive officer that I knew and told him that we wanted to use the 25th Place building as an undercover operation for 6 months. I then told him the property manager refused to lease it to us. He said he would call him. I told him, when you do, don't tell him we're law enforcement. The executive told him we were okay, just go ahead and rent it. They let us have it for $100 a month, including electricity, but the heating system was broken. Inspector Miller gave me a small office in the basement of the 2nd District, which was formerly a large storage closet. It had a larger room outside that we could use for the detectives and the FBI secretary. Bob Lill worked out of the Washington FBI field office. All during the operation, I only saw Bob Lill once or twice a week. Our primary source of communication was telephone. Unbeknownst to me at that time, he was also the supervisor for ABSCAM. ABSCAM was an FBI undercover operation that led to the arrest of 30 politicians, 6 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 1 United States Senator, a mayor, and other elected officials. No wonder he only saw me 2-3 times a week. Sergeant Mattis and I went to the building. The street entrance had a set of steps that went up to the 2nd floor landing. At the landing, there was a door with a window leading into the office space. The office space was about 30 feet by 40 feet with no interior walls other than the bathroom. There were 4 windows, 3 facing 25th Place and 1 looking down 25th Place, which was good. We'd be able to see anyone coming down the street. We put together a basic floor plan that we knew we'd be changing as we progressed. We ordered 3 telephone lines. One would be for the thieves to call us, the other would be for administrative purpose. The other was going to be a prop and for the suspects to use. While we were building the shop, we constantly reminded ourselves of the safety factors we had to adhere to. We were not going to let what happened in New York happen to us. For the construction, I assigned Sergeant Mattis, detectives Bob Schaefer, Bob Lilly, and Bill Gately. Bob Lill assigned Agent Mike Hartman. They all had experience in construction, but Sergeant Mattis was more experienced. The first thing we did was cover the 3 front windows with cardboard. All the walls that we were going to put up would be covered with wooden panel sheets. The first wall we built was a 3-foot wide wall in front of the windows, creating a narrow corridor towards the corner. We then cut a hole in it for a vent so that the backup officer assigned there would be able to see into the main shop. The other end of the wall, we angled the wall again for the TV video booth and cut a hole in it for a 2-way mirror. In the back of the shop, we built another 3-foot wide wall, creating another narrow hallway from the video room to the backup room that we were going to build. This allowed us to enter the video room and to see out the window down 25th Place. We then built a wall towards the entrance door and angled it to the door. We put a door in the center for access to the back room. We then built the counter, which was going to be the hub of our defensive strategy. It was about 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, and attached to the walls on each side. On the countertop, we used 2 layers of 3/4-inch plywood with a sheet of diamond plate steel between them, and then covered it all with carpet. About 10 feet behind that counter, we built another short counter. Its outward purpose was to take telephone orders, but it was actually another backup position. Under the counter, we put cinder blocks filled with sand. The cinder blocks couldn't be penetrated by a .357 Magnum. How do we know that? We tried it. We put the same cinder block walls under the vent room, the backup counter, and the TV room. Under the counter, we knocked a hole in the wall so that the vent backup officer could enter and exit. I asked Sergeant Gabe Brandani, who was the department's expert in electronic surveillance, to help us set up the video cameras and sound. He put a microphone hidden in an electric receptacle on top of the counter, right in front of where the thieves would be standing. We also installed a working receptacle on top of the counter that would be used to test the electric equipment that would be brought in. We installed a monitor from the video camera to the backup room so that the detectives could see what was going on. It wasn't necessary to put speakers back there because the walls were so thin they could hear everything. We didn't want anybody just walking in unannounced, so we put an electric lock on the door and controlled it with a button under the counter. We disabled the turnkey on the lock so that once you were in the shop, you couldn't get out unless you were buzzed out. The FBI put in an alarm system. If someone entered the building after hours, it would call the FBI Washington field office, Bob Lill and me, and Sergeant Mattis. We put alarm contacts inside the street door and tied them into an audio alert box under the counter. Whenever the door was open, it would send a signal to the box letting us know that someone was coming in. When you stepped through the street door, to the right there was a set of steps going up to the shop. To the left of the steps was a dark hallway with a closet in the back. We drilled a small hole in the door for the video camera. The video monitor was upstairs near the counter, and we put another monitor in the back room. As I said, we had 3 telephone lines. 2 phones were mounted on the wall behind the backup position. One was for administrative purposes. The other was for the suspects to call in and would be recorded. DC had a one-party consent law, which meant as long as one person involved in the recording was aware it was being done, it was legal. It covered both audio and video recordings. The third line was an old Princess phone with a long extension cord that would reach the counter and be used by the counterman or suspects if they had to call one of their other thieves. That line was not recorded. If someone was standing close to the counter and pulled out a gun holding it at their side, no one could see it until it was too late. But the backup man behind the vent could see it. I had them install red Christmas lights in the ceiling behind the person standing at the counter. Only the counterman and the backup man could see it. We also put one in the TV room, one in the backup room, and one under both counters. We put a light switch inside the vent room to control the lights. If the vent man saw a gun, he would flip the switch, alerting everyone. They thought that was a little overkill, but I insisted. In the beginning, our TV camera didn't have a time-date generator, so we mounted a calendar and a clock on the wall in view of the camera. We also had whiskey and drinking glasses on the counter. The counterman was to offer them a drink, and when they left, the glass would be taken to the back room and dusted for fingerprints. Later on, we got a camera that did have a time-date generator, so we didn't need the calendar and the clock, but we kept the whiskey and glasses. For security purposes, we needed to stop using the company name of PFF when dealing with law enforcement not involved in the operation. So we nicknamed it The Hole. We also nicknamed the crew The Hogs. We needed a code name for the operation itself. Operation PFF wasn't going to cut it. Operation The Hole wouldn't cut it either. So I got to thinking what we were doing was just like the movie Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman, where they pulled off a big con against organized crime. Well, that was us, so I named it Operation Sting. Agent Lill and I knew who was going to be assigned where. We let the men choose their own aliases. They used what they thought were Italian names with multiple vowels, which were actually codes to communicate in front of the thieves. Sergeant Mattis would be in charge. Detective Lilly would play the part of the counterman, alias Pasquale La Rocca. The backup man would be FBI agent Mike Hartman, alias Mike Baranzo. Detective Schaefer would be the cameraman, alias Bohanna LaFontaine. Detective Gately would be the vent man, alias Tony Bonanno. Before Bob, Lil, and I let them start recruiting potential thieves, we had to be sure that everyone knew their part and that all the safety precautions would be adhered to. So Sergeant Madison and I played the bad guys and went through several scenarios. One of us would stand outside the entrance door and get buzzed in. When we came in the door, the first sound we would hear was Agent Hartman racking a shell into his shotgun. Then sometimes we would walk over to the counter and pretend to sell stolen items. We'd ask Pat questions, trying to get him to slip up, but Pat was sharp and gave quick, logical responses to everything we threw at him. Sometimes, while one of us was standing in front of the counter, we'd pull out a toy gun and hold it at our side. They knew it was coming, but they just didn't know when. Pat would immediately drop down under the counter to get him out of any crossfire. The backup man would point the unloaded shotgun at us, demanding we drop our gun. The plan was to disarm them and rough them up a little, and then throw them out, hoping that they would tell their friends that we were serious guys. We had the evidence, we had the video, and we could arrest them later. But this time, no officer was going to get hurt. Fortunately, it never happened. Sometimes one of us would start to jump over the counter. That was when the vent man would drop the vent door and take control. We then had everyone switch roles so we would have a fallback option in case someone didn't show. It wasn't long before they had it down pat. For security purposes, we didn't want them staggering in at different times. We had them make arrangements to meet in the morning at a shopping center several miles away. That way, they could all come in one car and park in the garage out of sight. Going home, they would take different routes and were constantly looking behind them to make sure that no one was tailing them. All suspects were told they had to call first or they wouldn't be allowed in. Pat would tell them he didn't want them walking in on somebody else's deal, and I'm sure you didn't want anyone walking in on your deal. So always call first. There were no cell phones back then. If you weren't home, you used one of the payphones on the streets. Pat was to tell them that the corner Amico station's payphone was the best place to call because it was so close. Incidentally, back in those days, a call was just a dime. I guess that's how the expression, dropping a dime on someone, originated. Making a 10-cent call to rat someone out. Little did they know they were ratting themselves out. It was time to open for business and start buying stolen property. The question was how? We didn't want to use informants to put the words out because if they were informant to us, they were probably informant to other law enforcement, or worse, telling their friends. It was just too risky. So we came up with the scout system. It was pretty straightforward. Undercover officers would go out and talk to known criminals and then introduce them to PFF. Detective Tulson and Agent Harrison teamed up again and used the following procedures. We borrowed a couple of typewriters from IBM, a TV, and loaded them into the trunk of the undercover car. They were to go to high crime areas on the other side of the city and recruit targets. When they spotted one, they would drive past them. Agent Harrison, alias Eddie, would get out about a block away. Detective Tulson, alias Al White, would drive around the block and then approach the target. He'd ask the target if he wanted to make some quick cash. If the target said yes, Al would get out of the car, open the trunk, and show him the loot. Then he would tell him that he knew this fence that paid top dollar. No questions asked. But he had a problem. He owed the guy money, so he couldn't do it himself. Then he would tell him, if you bring the stuff in and sell it to this guy for $500, bring the cash back to me, I'll give you $20. If the guy agreed, they get into the car and drive to where Eddie was. Al would tell the target, you know, there's some pretty heavy stuff back there. Let me see if this guy wants to help. Al would drive up to Eddie and ask him if he wanted to make some quick cash. When Eddie agreed, Al would get out of the car and show him what was in the trunk. Once all three were in the car, Al would head for the hole. While driving, Al would say to Eddie, you seem like a pretty sharp guy. When we get there, why don't you do all the talking But be careful, these are scary guys from New York. They may even be connected. They have rules. You have to call them first and ask if they want to buy your stuff. You just don't walk in. When they got to the Amico station payphone, Al would pull over next to it and tell him that this was the closest payphone to the place. He then gave Eddie a dime and a piece of paper with PFF's telephone number. Eddie would get out and call PFF, letting him know they were coming in with a target. When they got to PFF, Al and the target would get out and take the loot out of the trunk. When they opened the street door, the warning alarm went off upstairs. Pasquale would then hold the movie clapper up for the camera. And the target got to the second floor, Pasquale would buzz them in. As soon as they walked in, Mike Forenzo racked a shell into his shotgun. When they looked over, they saw Mike was holding a shotgun. Mike was not smiling. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Once they were inside, Al did all the talking. Pasquale looked over the typewriters, plugged them in, and tested them. Then he looked over the guns. He offered them $200. Al said that wasn't enough. He wanted $500. Pasquale said, okay, but only because this is your first time. During their conversation, Pasquale would tell Al that they were from New York and would pay top dollar. He told Al that if he had more stuff to sell, that he would take it. But remember, you have to call first. Pasquale never said anything to the target other than hi. When they were leaving, Pasquale told Eddie to take one of his business cards on the counter. Eddie took one, and without asking, the target took one as well. When they got back to the car, Eddie gave the money to Al, who paid them each $20. He then took the target back to where they first met and let him out. This scouting system went on for about 2 weeks. It wasn't long before some of the targets were bringing in their own stolen items. Because of entrapment issues, we had no intention of letting them continue selling us stolen items. So when they called in a second time, Pasquale would tell them, word on the street is that the cops are watching you, so don't come back for a while. And even when they did call later, they were not allowed in. We never arrested the target, and at the end of the operation, we returned the stolen property to the victims. I guess since we weren't letting the targets come in anymore, they got their friends to come in. And when that person came in, told their friends, and then that person told their friends, and things started to snowball. Soon we were getting 5 to 6 visits a week. Because we were purporting ourselves to be a business, we were able to close on the weekends. The thieves were told, you know, we have an alarm system, but we also have Tony, an old retired hitman, sleeping in the back with the shotgun on weekends. That probably sounds funny to you, but they were totally convinced. Every police officer knows the procedure for documenting evidence, but this was more complicated. We had a crime that was committed in our presence, stealing stolen property. Each item had to be traced through police reports without letting the officer who took the report know we had the item. We also had to interview the victims without them knowing we had their property. And that was because some of the thieves were stealing from their families and friends. If we told the victim we had their property, more than likely they would tell the thief the police had their stolen property. It wouldn't take long for the thieves to figure out what was happening. That would keep the money in a metal box under the counter. All stolen items were taken into the back room and tagged. It was open a new case, which required a MPD 251 incident report and a 302 FBI report. Several of the thieves wanted to work for us, so Pat took advantage of that. He would tell them, if you want to work for us, I need to know about the jobs you pulled off. I don't want to hear about the ones you were arrested for. I want to hear about the ones you got away with. And they did. Some even wrote it down on paper. During the incidents, Pasquale would examine the items and whenever possible, hold them up in such a way so that the camera could zoom in and record serial numbers, etc. A video of the property with the thief in the picture was always taken. Pasquale was good at conning them. He was able to get their real names, and many times they would show him their driver's license to prove who they were. Pasquale would hold the license up at an angle so that the camera could zoom in. Pasquale was constantly ripping them off. For example, when they brought in an IBM Selectric typewriter worth several $1,000s, he discreetly turned off the inner switch while checking the item. Then when he plugged it in, it wouldn't work. He would then tell him, "This is broken. I can't use this. I have to have it fixed." He would then tell him, "I can't pay you top dollar." They would always settle for much less. Another con he would use was with government checks. He'd look at them and tell them, "I can't sell this because it's out of date or some other reason." He'd then tear it up and throw it in the trash can. They looked disappointed, but he'd give them a few bucks just to keep them happy. When the guy left, Pat would take the check out of the trash can, put it in an envelope, and present it as evidence. Pat would call me each night at home to keep me up to date so I could tell the inspector in the morning. Plus, Bob, Lil, and I would not get any unexpected surprises. Business began to escalate, causing two problems. One, they were running out of storage room in the back room. Two, they were working 16 hours a day just to keep up. You have to remember, back in those days, there was no such thing as overtime, just comp time, and many times you didn't even get that. There wasn't even pay for court time. We needed additional help. I went to Inspector Miller and told him we were running out of room at the hole and I needed a room to store the property. I needed another room for the follow-up detectives and agents that we were going to get. He gave us a large storage room for the property and locker room for the follow-up detectives and agents. The procedure was the same, except storage and follow-up was now being done at the 2nd District. Each night, the Hogs would bring that day's buys with the 251 incident report. They also brought that day's video reel, which was given to Detective Larry Cunningham, who is now in charge of the property room. Larry would sign for the property, document it, and store it on shelves from somewhere. I didn't ask. The video reels were separated by incident and put on VHS tapes. The next morning, the follow-up detectives would view the incidents on TV and make a Polaroid shot of the suspect for the file, and then start their follow-up investigation. One day, when loading the buys, Sergeant Mattis threw out his back and was put on sick leave. It was a real blow to the operation. For a while, I've been thinking of a way to get an old-time friend that I work with in Vice, Sergeant Harrigan, into the operation. Mike was ideal to fill in for Sergeant Mattis until he got back. Mike was working at the hole and caught on quickly. Bob, Lil, and I met with U.S. Attorney Earl Silbert at the U.S. District Court and advised him what we were doing. He assigned a couple of DAs to oversee the cases. After about a week, the DA came to me and said they want to go to the hole and give him a crash course on entrapment. I told him, okay, but lose that suit. And when he got there, he told Pat, stop asking where they ripped off the property, instead ask them where they stole the items. I guess he wanted to show stronger intent for the trial. Pat was apprehensive, but did it anyway. Bottom line, didn't make any difference. They never questioned it. One day, FBI agent Tom Easton walked in and told me that Bob Lil had sent him over to help out with the investigations and paperwork. Believe me, I was grateful. The next day, he brought in 5 FBI clerks and more filing cabinets. Tom was a fantastic administrative manager. He got things running smooth in a very short time, but he was also slick. For example, we only had one copy machine that made one copy at a time. Tom said he wanted to lease a copy machine that made multiple copies at the same time. I thought that was a good idea until he told me it was $1,500 a month lease. I told him we couldn't afford it. We needed the money for buys. A few days later, a multiple copy machine came rolling in. I asked Tom, how did we get this? He said, Bob, you signed the approval form. I said, no, I didn't. Then he told me that he put the requisition form in a pile of papers that I was to sign every day. I guess that red tape jinx struck again. But seriously, if it wasn't for Tom's relentless drive for perfection, we might never have gotten a 99% conviction rate. As I mentioned in the beginning, we arrested 565 thieves. On average, each of them came in 3 to 5 times and stayed 5 to 10 minutes. That comes to over 450 hours of video. Obviously, I'm not going to show you all of them, but here's a few clips. As I said, we recovered over 3,500 stolen items valued at $5.5 million, which in today's dollars would be over $22 million. I'm going to show you some of the items we bought. We bought over 100 guns. We bought over 1,500 credit cards, over 700 savings bonds, over 100 welfare checks. The guy who stole them told Pasquale that he walked into the HUD building without being challenged, went to an office, saw a pile of checks, took a handful, put them in his pocket, and left. Incidentally, HUD didn't even know it until 3 weeks later. 18 automobiles. Most were new cars stolen from dealerships. Pat was able to buy them for just $100 each, but there were two problems. One was storage, and the other was getting the vehicles back to the owners because we couldn't wait for months to return them. After Pat bought the first one, he said, "What do I do with this vehicle?" I thought for a while, and then I told him, "Put the VIN number in your 251, then take it to one of the police district's parking lot and park it in the district commander's spot. That way it was sure to be recovered." They did that 16 more times. I heard that the commanders were having meetings trying to figure out what was going on. Bob Lill and the other agents thought it was funny and were razzing us. So one night I had the Hogs take a vehicle and put it in the basement of FBI headquarters. It stayed there for 3 days before they found it. No more razzing. I then told Pat to stop buying cars, they're just too much of a hassle. We bought 220 selective typewriters and a ton of other office equipment. We bought an electric cardiogram, a bearskin rug, a bunch of jewelry, some chainsaws, fur coats, and more. PFF had over 1,600 buys. Each one had a story to tell. Most of them were pretty straightforward. They come in, sold us the stolen property, told us where they got it, got their money, and left. But some incidents were unique and sometimes comical. Here's just a few. One guy used to come in his post office uniform and went through the bag on the counter, pulling out welfare checks and selling them. Then there was the time a guy called and said that he had a load of Christmas toys that he wanted to sell for $5,000, and that was including the truck. When he and the other guy came in, Pasquale asked him where he got the truck. This guy said he was the truck driver for L&H Sales in Prince George County. So I'm going to tell him that I got held up. Pasquale told the guy to give Bohanna the keys so he can check them out. Bohanna and another hog went down and looked at the truck's contents. It was fully loaded and probably worth over $50,000. When Bohanna came back, he told Pasquale it looked good. Pasquale called me and told me about the toys. I told him, "We're not paying $5,000 for anything." Pat said, "Well, what do I do?" My first thought was to refuse to buy, let the guy drive away, and then we'll send undercover operatives and hijack the truck. Then I told him I'd call him back. I called the assistant district attorney who's been helping us with the cases and asked him if we could hijack the truck in an undercover capacity. He told me that he'd call me right back. A few minutes later, he called back and said seizing the truck was doable, but he didn't recommend it. I called Pat back and told him what the DA said, but try and get it for less than $5,000. Pasquale haggled with the guy and got it for $850. I still think we should have hijacked the truck. Pasquale then told the guy, "If you're going to tell your boss you were held up, you sure don't look like it. Why don't you let Bohanna work you over so you can look the part?" The guy looked over at Bohanna, who was smirking. You could see the fear come over the guy's face. The guy said, "Oh, that's all right, I'll be back." And they left. Pat then called me and asked what he should do with the truck. Since it was close to Christmas and I didn't want to be an Ebenezer Scrooge, we had the manifest, the VIN number, the video, the guy's name and address, and would later have a police report. So I had Detective Tolson drive the truck downtown with Agent Harrison following him in his car. I told Vince that when he got downtown to stop at a traffic light, turn off the engine, take the keys with you, get in the car with Harrison, and come back. That way the truck would be recovered and a bunch of kids would not be disappointed at Christmas. One day, Lieutenant Mousery came into the hold to just check on things. The Hogs had just made some meatballs and put them on a tray. One half was regular meatballs, the other half was so spiced up you could hardly eat them. Pat said to Lieutenant Mousery, "Since Agent Hartman isn't here yet, how about you being my backup for this guy coming in?" Mo agreed. They gave him a shotgun, a tam-type hat, and a pair of wraparound sunglasses. When the thief came in, Pasquale offered Mo a meatball. Mo knew which side to pick from and started eating it. Pasquale then turned the tray around and offered one to the thief. When the thief started chewing on it, he started sweating, eyes tearing, trying to remain calm. Pasquale asked him, "How you like the meatballs?" The guy's eyes were tearing and could only shake his head. As soon as he got his money, he left. This is the kind of stuff the Hogs did to relieve their stress. Because PFF was just about a mile from the Maryland state line, we were getting a lot of Maryland thieves. One day I got a call from ATF agent Eddie Seibert, who had been working with us tracing guns. Eddie told me that he had gotten a call from Prince George County Detective Dave McCambly. The name David Camley sounded familiar to me. The detective told him that one of his informers had gone into PFF and they were buying guns. Agent Simon said that Detective McCambly even went into the bus terminal across the street and was watching people bring boxes and bags into PFF. And he said, "I told him not to worry about it, that ATF has it covered." Apparently that didn't satisfy him. He continued with his investigation. So I called and asked for a meeting with Prince George County Chief of Detectives, Major Jim Ross, who I knew from when we were both young detectives and worked several cases together. When I got to his office, I told him about Detective McCambly and a little of what was going on. He told me that he already knew what McCambly was doing and about the ATF conversation. Jim had his dispatcher radio the detective to come in. When Detective McCambly walked in, he looked over at me and said, "Lieutenant P.T. Mott, how you doing?" I guess I knew him. To make a long story short, Major Ross told Detective McCambly he was now working with us. Dave turned out to be a great asset. He was able to identify many of the thieves from Maryland just by looking at the videos. He pulled police reports, mugshots, and records of all the suspects and gave them to Tom Easton. Incidentally, the informant called a couple days later and said that he had something to sell. When he got to the hole, when he was standing at the counter, Bohanna came in with the shotgun under his coat, but made it a little visible. Walked over to the counter, stood right next to the informant, and said, "That guy'll never be able to snitch again." Pasquale then asked him, "Did you clean everything up?" Bohanna said, "Sure did." Bohanna kept looking at the guy with a mean face. The informant looked terrified, took his money, and left quickly. That afternoon, the informant called Detective McCambly and told him he was wrong, that those guys are not buying guns in PFF. The next time we saw him was months later when we arrested him. As soon as we started getting items that were stolen as a result of a violent crime, we knew we had to get those thieves off the street. We couldn't wait until the operation ended to arrest them. Here's a few examples. We bought items that were stolen in armed robberies, wallets taken from rape cases. We even bought a gun that was used in a murder. As soon as it started happening, Bob Little and I met with Sergeant Blake, who I had worked with in the 14th Precinct. We asked him if he would discreetly give the names of these violent criminals to the detectives working those cases. He was to tell them that he had a reliable informant who had given him the information. I'm sure you'll agree that PFF is a reliable informant. In every case, it was enough to get a warrant and get him off the street. As a result, Don was able to get over 30 violent criminals off the street and convicted. Hosmer Harrigan was in the hole a little over a month when we got another grant from LEAA. Bob and I agreed Hosmer Harrigan should supervise the new fencing operation during the construction and during the operation. The problem was we were back to square one. So I brought in Sergeant Jim Sefcik, who was already working at 2D with the background staff. It didn't take him long to get acclimated. He not only supervised it, but he was very experienced with video. We had a good thing going with PFF. We had thousands of dollars of stolen property and hundreds of warrants to get at some point and start making arrests. We used the same concept as PFF, but in this one we had all black detectives and agents. We rented an old truck repair garage on 12th Street Northwest on the other side of the city. We named it H&H Trucking. GYA stood for Gotcha Again. Sergeant Harrigan would play the owner, Mr. Goldberg. The rest of the crew was Revolt and Coley, FBI agent Charles Harrison, Vince Tolson, Sterling Robinson, William Wilson, Charles Battle, and Ann Scott. They built GYA using the similar construction and safety techniques as PFF. The difference was, in this one, we installed 3 video cameras. One behind a two-way mirror behind the counter. The other camera faced the counter from the back wall. We didn't need a vent room, but we still kept the arm fallback option. One camera was outside the entrance door where they could talk to the thieves and buzz them in using the electric lock. I also made sure that they installed the red warning lights. Before they opened, Sergeant Harrigan and I put them through the same safety rehearsals as PFF. The GYA building was large enough so that we could keep the property and the investigators in the same building. Detective Tolson, alias Al White, and Agent Harrison, alias Eddie, were the countermen. We used the same scouting system to bring in the targets. Within a couple of months, they were getting buys almost every day. Some of the thieves were complaining that the Italian guys on the other side of town were giving better prices. Al White would tell them, "You shouldn't trust those Italian guys, you better stay with the brothers." We now had 2 operations going. From the beginning, one of our concerns was, what if a policeman came in and tried to bribe us? What should we do? That never happened, but unfortunately it did with an assistant district attorney. Loretta Butler, a prostitute who was selling us stolen credit cards that she was stealing from her Johns, told Pasquale she was providing sex to a DA to drop cases against her. As soon as we learned about it, Bob Little and I met with the U.S. Attorney Earl Silbert and brought him up to date. Robinson called and said that Loretta Butler asked him to call. He and Pat talked back and forth, and Pat told him about a guy he wanted him to take care of. Robinson said he'll look into it. The next time Robinson called, Bob Lill made arrangements for an agent working undercover in organized crime to be ready to come to the hole and play the boss if it went through. A few days later, Robinson called and made an appointment to come to PFF the following week. Mr. Robinson came in, Pasquale and the agent had a 90-minute conversation. Bottom line, he agreed to see if he could get the case dropped. GYA was on a roll. It was time to get arrest warrants for PFF. We didn't want to just go out there and start arresting them all at once, because word would get out and they'd scatter, and then it would take months to round them up. We needed to arrest as many as we could at the same time. First, we had to finalize the arrest warrant affidavits for each incident, have them approved by an assistant district attorney, and get them signed by a judge. As you probably know, when law enforcement applies for a warrant, it must include the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how. The who was easy. We had their real names. The what was easy too. Just arrest them. The when, we chose February the 28th, which was a Saturday, and they all knew we were closed on weekends, so there wouldn't be any unexpected visits. As for where, it would be at PFF. We figured the best way to get them to all come in at the same time would be to throw a party for them. As they came in over the next 3 weeks, Pasquale would tell them that he was getting a promotion, and to thank them, he was going to throw a party. He told them the party was on February the 28th. He would have door prizes, booze, weed, and lots of girls. He also told them that his boss, the Don from New York, might even be there. He might even offer them a job. They all seemed very excited. As they come in, Pasquale would tell each of them to come in at different times so they could meet the Don. The times were really staggered so they wouldn't be piling up outside the door. We needed to arrest a few at a time. The last week before the 28th, Pasquale started calling the ones that didn't come in. Since the 5th District was closest to us, we wanted to use it to process them after they were arrested. We asked the chief if we could use the 5th District, and he approved. We also needed a couple officers from ID division there to take fingerprints and mugshots. The first thing we did was knock a hole in the wall from PFF into the warehouse. Then we built deck-style steps down into the warehouse. After they were arrested and cuffed, they would be brought down the steps into the warehouse, where a uniformed officer would take custody of them and remain with them throughout the process. To the left of the steps, we built strip search booths. They would be manned by 2 policemen and a policewoman. Along the wall, we would put benches for the prisoners awaiting transport to the 5th District. When there was 8 to 10 accumulated, they would be taken to the rear loading dock and loaded into U-Haul trucks that we were going to rent. We would have 2 plainclothes officers with police radios assigned to each truck. We knew that once the 5th District was closed, the press would be all over it. So the drivers of the trucks were told to use different routes to and from PFF. As an extra precaution, we would have 2 motorcycle units follow the empty trucks from the 5th District to PFF, just in case the press was following. If the trucks were being followed, they would radio the truck driver to stop at the next traffic light. Once stopped, the motormen would hold up the traffic both ways until the truck was out of sight. Obviously, there was a lot going on. This was a need-to-know operation. The police officers that were going to take those assignments were to be at the 5th District early in the morning on the 28th. Once they were all there, they'd be told about the operation, and everyone but the motormen would be taken to the hole in the back of U-Haul trucks we were going to rent. When they got to the hole, they were given their assignments. On Thursday the 26th, the chief was going to send out a teletype stating that all 5th District officers will report to the 4th District for checking on and checking off. Obviously, that was going to create a lot of questions from not only the police, but the press as well. We needed somebody at the 5th District to head up the interrogations and paperwork for court Monday. About a week before the party, I met with a good friend, Lieutenant Lou Bancato. He was commander of the 4th District Detectives. I brought him up to date about the operation and showed him some videos. I asked him if he would put together an interrogation team and a plan for the night of the party. He agreed right away. His operation plan would require at least 20 detectives for interrogations, 2 ID officers to take fingerprints and mugshots, 10 uniform officers for prisoner control, 1 officer to control the parking lot, and 4 officers in transport wagons to take the prisoners to the cell block. All personnel would come to the 5th District at 5 p.m. At that time, he would tell them about the operation and what their assignments were. The plan also called for a coordination officer at the warehouse. As the thieves were arrested, the coordinator was to call him with the names and warrant numbers of those arrested. That way, he could have his interrogation teams ready when they come in. When the U-Haul truck arrived, the gate would be open and the prisoner control officers would escort the prisoners into the building. When the paperwork was completed, the control officers would escort the prisoners to the transport wagons to be taken to the central cell block. We would have 4 arrest teams. Team 1. I asked Lieutenant Mouser to head up the arrest team 1, which would be at the hole for the party. He agreed. Lieutenant Mouser would be armed with an automatic handgun. Sergeant Hook Trailer would be armed with a shotgun. Pete Bignati and 2 other uniformed officers would have their service weapons. I gave him the scenario of what Pat and the Hogs were going to take when the prisoners come in, and that was. Pasquale would tell him because the Don was there, he had to have his men pat them down. A couple of Hogs would then come out of the back room, pat them down, and return to the backup room. Pasquale would then hold up his badge and tell them that they were under arrest. When they heard Pasquale arrest them, Sergeant Trailer would enter, followed by Lieutenant Marsry and the 3 control officers. They would grab them, put them against the wall, search them again, and cuff them with cable ties. They would then be taken to the back room where the Hogs would attach a tag to the cable ties, putting their name and warrant numbers on it. Other control officers would then take him down the stairs into the warehouse. It was obvious that all of the suspects were not going to come to the party. We didn't want to wait till the next day to get the ones that didn't show up to the party, because by then the word would have been out and they'd be scattered all over the city. We needed a plan to arrest them immediately after the party. Since Sergeant Blake was already working with us, Bob Lill and I asked him to put together Plan 2. Don put together the following plan. The Chief of Police would put out a teletype on Thursday, 2 days before the party, telling all district and division commanders to have a uniformed sergeant with a patrol car, 2 uniformed officers in a patrol wagon or transport car, and 2 detectives in cruisers report to the training division at 8 p.m. February the 28th. That would involve almost 350 officers. At 9 p.m., they would all be told about the operation and shown some of the buy videos. All the arrest units would have one sergeant in a patrol car, 2 uniformed officers in a patrol car, and 2 officers in a transport vehicle. There would also be FBI agents, DEA agents, ATF agents, U.S. Marshal's Office, and a postal inspector to go with them whenever it involved their agency. The coordinator was to call him with the names and warrant numbers of those arrested so he could cross them off his list of warrants. Arrest Team 3 was to serve arrest warrants to all those that didn't show up for the party. Detective McCambly was obviously the best choice. He put together several squads of arrest teams almost exactly like Team 2 did, and at the end of the party, the coordinator would give him the names and warrant numbers of all the suspects arrested so that he could eliminate them from his list. The task was given to FBI agent Tom Easton. He, along with other FBI agents and the Montgomery County Police Department, would go to his house at 7 p.m. and arrest him. Even though we told them to come in at staggered times, we knew they weren't going to follow. There would probably be a pileup at the entrance door because they weren't coming in on their scheduled time. So we would have one of the hogs stand at the top of the stairs outside the entrance door to act as a doorman, letting only 3 or 4 come in at a time. At the foot of the steps, we would put a speaker that would play loud music to cover any noise coming from the arrests in the hall. On the Thursday before the party, I got a phone call from Tony Howes, a reporter with the Washington Star. She told me that she knew about Operation Sting and wanted to meet with me. We met at McDonald's. She told me that she knew about the operation but didn't know where or who was involved other than me. She wanted to know where it was. That wasn't going to happen. She then asked me to verify her information. When I didn't, she asked me for an exclusive after it went down. I told her I'd see what I could do. Finally, Saturday came and it was time to make the sting. I'm going to show you a few clips of the more interesting arrests. Otherwise, it would go on for hours.
Hey, oh la la! Hey, looky here! Huh? Hey, man, I thought you were fucking your drugs up for hey, looking good. Hey, what you doing, man? Hey, listen, little protection on the hay. Never will respect the dog. Hey, boss, Wally, the best. Yes, definitely. Hey, listen. You're packing a piece of everybody. You want to hey, put a little bit. I got some other young. Hey, I got a job. No, you got please. We don't want to down anybody there. You can down it, so we heard this room around. Hey, you got a spike. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Hey, you want some of that crack there? Thank you, Hey, listen, I tell you what. Come on, Angelo. Go get you after you meet the boss. Hey, listen, I got some prize for you. I think you won't like it, okay? I'm a police officer in your courthouse. No, we got the yellow water.
Now this guy escaped from the robbery squad, taking the handcuff with him, and went to the party, only to get arrested again.
My man, he just escaped. Y'all know he's on escape. Hey, well, how you doing, man? Hey, listen. Hey, you just escaped. We're going to have to hide him. So, listen, did you see anything suspicious? Okay, yeah. One thing, I got to put protection on my boss there real quick. He got the pieces with you. If you do, I want him. I'll get him back to you at the apartment. Okay, I want him to pull in and Tony check you out, okay? Go ahead, Tony. Whatever it is. Hey, come here. We got to figure out how to get them motherfuckers. What's that?
that. Like, what happened, man? I robbed something.
This the guy I got busted. Wait. Don't go nowhere. What you got?
I robbed something, you know. They like girl things. The rollers quarters.
Well, they don't have any evidence on you.
Who
did you open that car?
I didn't even know the girl, really.
You pick up with a gun, you have the piece, you want to hide it?
No, I read through a piece of
Where was this?
both in them.
God, man, I hope you don't bring no heat on you. Okay, you don't even know the real thing. Good for hey, get off. I want you to know that you'll have a good time with it, okay? You're going to meet the boss, yes? When you're coming down. Hey, what it is, huh? Hey, you see? Check it to make sure there's no pieces. Come on, hey, go here's the guy.
What's this matter?
Shorty, it's sound is looking good. Hey, is officer around there? No. Hey, I gotta protect my people. Okay, I just deal with it. No, I get the door prize. Get the door prize. I know I got door prize. Come here. Now, the thing I want to tell you is this. You're under arrest. Hey, some dude's gonna tell me your name is not Rick. What is it?
My first name is Lee. Oh, yeah. I say people with a nickname, I say everybody call. Yeah.
Hey, listen. Six, sir. What's going on? Hey, yeah, okay. I just put protection on my people. What do you got? A cookie truck out there or something? Ice cream truck. Ice cream truck. You bring crazy on the He's ready for the party. With the money he got in his pocket, give him $100 now, too. Hey, man, I gotta tell you this. It's funny as shit. You're under arrest. Hey, don't worry about it. Hey, man. How you doing, my man? Hey, listen, Rick, where? Go ahead. Check to see if he's got any pieces. You got any pieces on him? Okay, we gotta put the pieces on. We don't want the law to get hurt. Hey, show a little respect for the dog. Big man. Yeah. It's a police. I'm a police. Okay, come on. Hey, what's the guy? Hey, is bigger than what's up?
Hey, Fishman, I told Fat he cut out on you, man.
He got him? No, he did. I said that.
Cameron.
All right.
Listen.
Hey,
Oh, we got three more coming
see,
down.
they're going to put protection on the bosses, right? I told you that, okay? As soon as the other two dudes get up here, then we'll, let you jam and get your door prize. It's a business deal. We're going to talk to you about it, okay? Hey, I told you, bring the peace.
Typical Bob Schaefer, always joking around. Pay attention to this guy. When he sees Hook Trailer come in at him with a shotgun, he faints.
Hey, listen. You pack the pieces with the we got it for Bob. He don't want the man to get hurt. Don't take it. You know?
No chance.
Hey, listen, what the business is what the piece they get. What the piece? Hang on. What the funniest fucking thing happened? You're under arrest.
You probably heard in the video Pasquale say to the thieves, show some respect for the Don. The Don was Sergeant Mattis, who he came back from sick leave for the party. When Pasquale told him to show some respect for the Don, Carl would look at them and say, bless you, my son. After doing this a couple of times, I went to Carl and said, Carl, you're not the Pope, you're the Don. From then on, he just nodded his head. When they stopped coming in, the coordinator told the arrest teams to begin serving warrants. teams 2 and 3 worked till way after daybreak. Between the two teams, they made a little over 220 arrests. Between the party arrest and the team arrest, they filled every district cell block, as well as the 50 cells at police headquarters, with 5 or 6 prisoners to a cell. On Sunday, the Operation Sting was on every Washington channel and every newspaper in Washington. Around 10 a.m. Monday, some of the hogs were at the hole packing up the equipment. I got a call from Agent Hopman, who told me that a guy had just called and said he had some government checks that he wanted to sell, and asked me, should he go ahead and take them? I said, of course.
What's it be for?
Robbery.
Robbery, armed robbery?
Yeah.
You packing your gun with you now, man? Let me just turn around, please. Just make sure. All right. Pack it back in the warehouse there. You know, I'm taking on myself.
I can dig it, man, no problem.
Yeah. What do you got for me today? Government checks?
Yeah.
Where the hell did you steal these? Out of the mail? What's stolen out of the mail down in Virginia, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you called to
Yeah,
Virginia.
I was working in, man, but I had to late because I couldn't move right then and there. You dig it?
What's stolen for 30 days?
Right.
Cool, man. Cool. How long have you been out of town?
Man, I've been out over 2 weeks because, I said, well, I got to dig you later, you know.
I heard word got arrested.
She had 2 beats and, you
read about this? Something about police, FBI arresting people.
Yeah, I heard about this, man. I wondered was that y'all, you know.
Yeah, it was. I'm an FBI agent. You're under arrest.
Police, get up against the wall.
Get over there.
Get the wall. Get the wall. Get the wall. What's that, you
After the equipment was packed up, Mike called me again and said he had a guy standing at the counter who wanted to sell some credit cards. Do you want me to buy them? I told him to go ahead, but keep me on the phone so I could hear the conversation. I could hear the guy tell Mike where the checks were stolen from. I then said to Mike, let me talk to this dummy. When the guy got on the phone, I asked him, did you really steal those checks? He said, yes. I then said, I'm Lieutenant Arscott with the DC Police Department. You're under arrest. Let me talk to Mike. I handed the phone back to Mike and said, he just told me I was under arrest. Can he do that? Mike said he sure can, and arrested him again. The guy pleaded guilty, so we never found out if arresting someone by telephone would hold up in court. On the same day, Chief Cullinane, SAC Agent Nick Stames, and DEA Earl Selvett gave their press conference. After the conference was over, the press was all over Bob Little and I. We gave him what we could. Since Tony House had kept her word, I took her into the property room along with her photographer. He took photographs of the property, and then he took this one. The next day, when her article and that picture hit the front page, the Associated Press picked it up and it went viral. The story and that picture was carried by almost every news network and newspaper in the country. They handled themselves well. They told the press a bunch of stories about the buys and arrests. The press ran with some of the stories. One of the stories was the Italian names and disguises they used and the Italian gibberish that they used. Their stories went viral. I then got a call from Bob Little, who told me that he had gotten a call from the New York FBI field office. An undercover agent heard some of the mafia people were pissed at our making fun of them and were going to give Pat and me a visit. We shrugged it off, but that night someone shot up Pat's car at his house. When the chief found out, he had detectives stake out our homes. Somehow the press got wind of the stakeouts and put it in the papers. They also had their political cartoonists put this cartoon in the paper as well. One day, Tony House came to me and said that she and Chuck Conconi, a writer for the Washingtonian magazine, were going to write a book about Operation Sting and wanted to know if we would cooperate. I talked to Bob Little and the Hogs, and we all agreed. A few months later, they come out with this book, The Washington Sting. It didn't make the bestseller, but it's online if you're really interested. Even with all that publicity going on, GYA was still buying stolen property. The buys didn't slow down. In fact, they increased. Some of the thieves that were arrested at the party were now going full-time to GYA. When they told Vince that they got busted at PFF, he told them, I warned you about those Italian guys. LEAA asked Bob Little and I if we would go and meet with these departments and give them a seminar. So for the next 3 months, Bob and I went to over 30 cities and gave our dog and pony show. At first it was just Bob Little and I, but later on we split up, and Bob would take some FBI agents with him on a trip, and I would take police officers with me. We split for two reasons. One, we were getting ready to start a third operation before we closed down GYA, and two, GYA property and warrants were piling up just like they did in PFF. We needed to make arrests, and soon. This time they gave out raffle tickets with $500 door prizes. Vince would tell them that the fix was in. We set a date of Saturday, July 7th. They put the word out using the same process that PFF did. Almost 80 suspects come in to get their $500 door prize and were arrested. The Sunday papers were filled with GYA stories just like it was in PFF. The chief, Nick Stames, and the U.S. attorney gave a press conference, have a conference with the GYA crew, and they did a great job, which escalated the publicity. About 2 weeks later, Chief Cullinane, Nick Stames, Bob Lill, me, the Hogs, and the GYA crew were all invited to the White House to meet the president. We were taken to the Situation Room. The president came in, shook hands with everyone, signed photos, and then we went outside to meet the press. As I said a few months earlier, before we closed GYA, we had set up another operation called Tricon, meaning the third con. Only this one was going to be completely different. Instead of them coming to us, we were going to go to them. Our target was guns, narcotics, and stolen property. We rented a two-story office building with a large garage on Missouri Avenue Northeast. The garage and the building had enough room for the property, the follow-up detectives, and administration. We purchased 10 old cars, 3 vans, and a street vendor truck. In the garage, we set up our own auto repair and paint shop using police officers with experience in those fields. The idea was that if a vehicle got made on the street, we would bring it in, paint it a different color, and change the tags that were loaned to us by the Maryland State Police. We converted the vendor truck into an ice cream truck with video and sound and drove it around buying narcotics and credit cards from prostitutes. The undercover officers and agents were making a lot of cases for narcotics, guns, credit card, government checks, and also making some high roller deals, which required them to have a place for the target to come to. The property was kept in the building, but we were running out of space for the admin staff and follow-up detectives. So they moved us to the old 7th Precinct in Georgetown, and they created a new unit called Special Project Unit. Apparently they felt that a higher ranking officer should now be in charge. So they added a captain, another lieutenant, and a few sergeants. Now the captain they assigned was newly promoted Captain Mousery. Made my day. Soon after we were in the building for a while, we had to close Tricon. In the interest of time, I'm going to show you a short news broadcast that pretty much covers the whole thing.
The suspects didn't know it, but they were dealing with undercover police officers. At dawn this morning, teams of FBI agents and DCs left the police academy and began the roundup. Their police cruisers were called sting units. The suspects were called targets. The targets were arrested in their homes, at their jobs, and on the street. This operation was called Tricon, short for Triple Con. It's the third time in the past year and a half that authorities have used an extensive undercover program to con and catch criminal suspects. This project was primarily aimed at drug pushers and fences, those who buy and sell stolen merchandise. Authorities say they've recovered $1 million in stolen goods and $100,000 in narcotics. In the previous sting operations, police used a storefront to make the purchases. This operation, in part, ran on wheels.
We became very mobile. As a matter of fact, we bought an ice cream truck, if you really want to know how we were mobile. And we went around the city and we bought from fences. We bought from drug dealers. We brought stolen checks. And we videotaped them right through the ice cream truck. And at the same time, we were selling ice cream and making a profit.
The ice cream truck was manned by undercover detectives. They sold ice cream and bought drugs. John's Honey Wagon also did business with a gang of thieves who burglarized schools, a car theft ring which sold new autos for $100, and a 16-year-old Montgomery County youth who sold pipe bombs. Authorities say that some big-time criminals were caught. As a result of the operation, 9 drivers and employees of the Central Delivery Company were arrested today at their office in Silver Spring. Police say the suspects were delivering narcotics. The owner of a barber shop on Benning Road, one of the most popular shops in the area, was arrested. He's accused of selling more cocaine than haircuts. 2 guards at the Lorton Reformatory were arrested. Undercover detectives were about to make a narcotics buy. The guards allegedly came along, flashed their badges, took the narcotics, and then walked away. Eyewitness News correspondent Pat Collins now has more on Tricon, Triple Con.
Tricon, Triple Con, grandson of Sting. It was headquartered in this office complex on Chilham Place in Upper Northeast. These were the executive offices. The dealing was done by a subsidiary across town. This is the secret fencing warehouse off New York Avenue near the railroad tracks. Delaney Enterprises, they called it. It was named in honor of the mother of one of the policemen. It was a clandestine operation. And what did they tell curious people who stopped by to see what really was going on? Anything they wanted to hear.
They thought it was a body repair shop. We told them that, yes, it's a body repair shop. We quote them a price which was extremely high, and they would usually be satisfied with that and leave.
This morning, the people of Delaney Enterprises had worked up a very big deal. A truckload of color television sets to be delivered here to the warehouse and picked up by 5 men who would then sell them throughout the area. This morning, the 5 men drove into this warehouse in a van. The truck stopped, the door opened, and they got out to pick up the TV sets. And this is what they saw.
Really, it looked just dumbfounding. They just couldn't believe it that a third thing had happened in this city, you know, and that they were part of it now.
The police and FBI used stories about stolen TVs and hot cars to attract fences and dope dealers to trade with them. In all, more than $1 million of stolen loot was recovered and $100,000 in drugs. They even provided curb service with an ice cream truck rigged with videotape cameras and microphones.
I played the role of a hustler, a little bit more than the average street hustler, a man with money. I drove a Lincoln, but I was turning over items of stolen property, gun, stolen coin collection, things of this nature. Kind of a freelance rent, you might say. The undercover cops used a bugged phone in a soundproof booth to set up the deals. The fences who called here thought it was a rooming house phone where the Delaney people lived. Are the crooks really as dumb as we think they are? Stevie, falling for this? No, I think it's more greed than it is dumbness. I think that that it's the money that they see. That brings them around. It's not so much dumb. They're not dumb what people think. With all these stings, gotcha again, and now Tricon, Police Chief Cullinane says he's sending out a message to all the thieves and crooks in the city of Washington. When you're doing something illegal, smile, he says. You might be on the police candid camera. I'm Pat Collins, Eyewitness News in Northeast Washington.
Yes, that pretty much covers the whole thing. After Tricon, the Washington Star newspaper put on a dance banquet for all those that worked in any of the Operation Sting. They also invited our wives, husbands, or friends. It was a great affair. We had gone a long way from that first operation on 8th Street. In closing, I want to leave you with this. The government statistics for all sting operations that went on from 1977 to 1981, 4 years, there were 4,222 arrests, 68,167 cases closed, $114 million in stolen property recovered. Based on those statistics, today there would be 135,000 arrests, 2 million cases closed, $64 million in stolen property recovered, all as a result of the very first sting operation. That's a long way from our first operation in 8th Street. When I announced I was going to retire, the newspaper wrote this article. At my retirement party, they gave me this red light with a switch, still busting my chops about the lights that I insisted on for safety. Contacted as many detectives and agents that I could find, asking them to verify and add some stories. Believe me, without their help, it would have been extremely difficult. If you're interested in what happened in Sting Security, hang on for a few more minutes. After all, I was just 42 years old, too young for the rocking chair, so I opened a security company and named it Sting Security. What other name you think I would use? I kept my motto, PT Mott, and made it part of the training curriculum. Within 5 years, I had undercover operatives. I even had my wife, Estelle, work undercover in a K jewelry store downtown Washington. We had a detective bureau. I used mostly retired Metropolitan Police detectives. Uniformed security officers. My first security guard was my oldest son, Bob Jr. Bob later joined the Prince George County Police Department and retired as a sergeant. Supervising security guards was a whole lot different than supervising detectives. Every week, we would interview about 50 to 60 people, which we netted down to about 20 to 25. While they were in our in-house training class, they were drug tested. Incidentally, back in those days, drug testing was only done for government jobs. Bottom line, we would end up with about 10 to 15 guards. But we still had a problem getting some of them to comply with their post orders. They'd miss patrols, come in late, were caught sleeping, etc. We needed something to guarantee they were doing their patrols correctly. So I had a software company develop a system that we called Patrol Command. The way it worked is that the guard, using a wireless handheld reader, would scan the metal barcode stickers that we had mounted throughout the post. When they completed their patrol, they would go to the comm box, put the reader into the modem, and telephonically send the data to our central station, giving the exact time and location of each scan. It worked just like the GPS systems used today, only this was 40 years ago. It was growing so fast, I hired an old friend who I had worked with on the department, retired Inspector Wayne Layfield, to head up the division. We went to security industry trade shows and sold several systems. We had a fleet of patrol cars, polygraph operators, an alarm central station that monitored small alarm company accounts. My youngest son, Kenneth, was the supervisor. Our central station was not only used to dispatch our security guards, it also monitored hundreds of alarms for small alarm companies. One of those companies was Centurion Protective Service, which was owned by my middle son, Mike. A consultant division for private industry. We gave full-day seminars to security guard companies throughout the United States, and I had a staff of 17 administrative officers. When I sold the company in 1998, we had over 900 security officers. We had a corporate customer base of about 200. We monitored over 3,000 burglar alarms and were the fourth largest security company in Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. After I sold the company, I was still not ready for the rocking chair, so I started another company called SGM and went around the country giving seminars to security guard companies. I later made a video of the seminar and sold them to guard companies around the country. It didn't take long before I started making other training videos, manuals, and CD templates. I went to security industry trade shows and met with hundreds of guard company executives. In 2020, I had over 3,000 customers when I sold the business to my youngest son, Ken. I'm proud to say that in just 1 year, Ken has taken SGM to a quantum leap. Today, it's one of the most popular online security guard companies around the country. Well, after 3 careers spanning 65 years, I'm probably going to have to use that rocking chair some. If you got this far, thanks. I appreciate you taking the time.